The atmosphere inside the Pentagon had turned extremely serious. Military planners were no longer discussing possibilities. Now they were discussing action. According to senior officials, the United States military had moved into a new operational phase. The objective was clear and direct: defeat, destroy, and disable every meaningful hostile military capability that could threaten American forces or its allies in the Middle East. Intelligence reports coming in from the region show that tensions were escalating rapidly, and the situation could spiral into a full-scale conflict at any moment. Because of this, the U.S. military command made an urgent decision that would trigger a massive chain reaction across multiple bases and fleets. Within hours, an emergency order was issued to deploy an additional 3,000 United States Marines toward the Middle East border region. The order was classified as urgent and immediate. Transportation assets across the military were activated without delay. Cargo aircraft, transport ships, helicopters, and rapid deployment units were all put on standby. At several major military bases across the United States, Marines had already begun assembling long before the public even knew anything was happening. The atmosphere on those bases was tense but disciplined. Soldiers lined up beside their gear, checking equipment again and again, making sure nothing was missing. On the flight line, rows of V-22 Osprey aircraft were waiting with engines warming. These unique aircraft, capable of both helicopter vertical takeoff and airplane speed flight, were chosen specifically because of their ability to move troops quickly over long distances. One by one, squads of Marines approached the aircraft. They were dressed in full combat equipment, helmets secured, body armor fastened tightly, rifles held firmly across their chests, and heavy backpacks filled with ammunition, supplies, and survival gear. Some Marines stood quietly and thought, while others exchanged quick words with their teammates. Everyone understood the seriousness of the mission ahead. Then the moment finally came. The order to board was given. The rear ramps of the Osprey aircraft slowly lowered toward the ground. Marines moved quickly but calmly, stepping into the cargo bays and securing themselves into their seats. The inside of the aircraft filled with the sound of metal equipment shifting and seatbelts locking into place. Within minutes, the ramps closed again, sealing the aircraft. Outside, the massive rotors began spinning faster and faster until the air around them roared with power. One by one, the Ospreys lifted off the runway and climbed into the sky, heading toward military ships already stationed deep in the region. Those ships waiting at sea were not ordinary transport vessels. They were massive floating military platforms capable of launching entire operations from the ocean. On board, another group of Marines had already been stationed for days, preparing for the possibility that they might be called into action at any moment. As the incoming aircraft approached the fleet, activity across the ships intensified. Officers gathered groups of soldiers below deck and began delivering rapid operational briefings. These briefings were short, direct, and focused entirely on survival and mission success. Inside the narrow compartments beneath the deck, commanders explained emergency procedures, rules of engagement, and possible battlefield scenarios. Maps were spread across tables while officers pointed out strategic locations where units might be deployed. Every Marine listened carefully. There was no room for mistakes. After the briefings ended, the soldiers immediately moved to begin final preparations. Across the ship, the sound of weapons being prepared echoed through the steel corridors. Ammunition crates were opened and magazines were filled carefully, round after round. Rifles were inspected and tested to ensure every mechanism worked perfectly. Sidearms were loaded and secured into holsters. Spare magazines were distributed and packed tightly into plate carriers. Machine gun teams assembled their heavy weapons piece by piece, mounting them on bipods and cycling the actions to confirm everything operated smoothly. The entire ship had become a giant preparation zone. Every Marine was doing something important. Some were loading ammunition, others were inspecting gear or checking communication equipment. Radio operators tested frequencies while squad leaders gathered their teams to repeat instructions. The tempo of activity never slowed. Everyone knew that when the order came, they would have only moments to move. While this intense preparation was happening at sea, one of the first Marine deployment groups had already reached its landing point somewhere in the vast deserts of the Middle East. The Osprey aircraft descended quickly and touched down on the dusty ground. As soon as the rear ramps dropped open, Marines rushed out carrying their equipment. The desert wind kicked up clouds of sand around them as they moved into position. Their mission was not to attack immediately. Instead, they had been tasked with something equally important: establishing a temporary forward operating base that would serve as a staging ground for the thousands of troops expected to arrive afterward. And they had to build it from nothing. Within minutes of landing, the Marines began unloading crates and heavy packs from the aircraft. The first priority was concealment. Camouflage netting was stretched across poles and secured with stakes to reduce the visibility of the camp from aerial surveillance. Next, teams erected temporary overhead shelters using canvas tarps and lightweight metal frames. These structures would provide shade from the harsh desert sun and limited protection from sandstorms. But building the camp was only the beginning. The Marines immediately began digging defensive positions around the perimeter. Fighting holes were carved into the ground while observation posts were placed at strategic angles overlooking the surrounding desert. Sandbags were filled rapidly and stacked into protective walls. Fields of fire were cleared so that defenders would have unobstructed lines of sight if enemies approached. Communication equipment was also installed quickly. Antennas rose above the camp and radio operators established a secure link with command units and the naval fleet positioned offshore. Within only a few hours, what had started as an empty stretch of desert had transformed into a fully functioning forward military camp, complete with defensive barriers, covered positions, and active communications. Back on the ships, Marines continued preparing for combat in another way, live fire training. On the upper deck, temporary targets were set up along the rear section of the ship known as the fantail. Groups of shooters rotated through combat marksmanship drills. Each Marine practiced aiming, firing, and adjusting their optics to ensure perfect accuracy. Between firing sessions, soldiers carefully zeroed their weapons, calibrating sights to match the expected engagement distances they might face once deployed on the ground. The training never stopped. One group fired weapons while another group loaded magazines. A third group cleaned rifles and checked equipment for wear or damage. It was a continuous cycle of preparation designed to make sure every soldier would be ready the moment combat began. Meanwhile, far away at military logistics bases, another crucial part of the operation was unfolding. Massive cargo aircraft were being loaded with everything needed to sustain thousands of troops in a harsh environment. Forklifts and cargo loaders moved non-stop across the runways as armored vehicles were carefully driven into transport planes. Once inside, chains and heavy restraints secured them firmly to the cargo bay floors. Behind those vehicles, pallets of ammunition were stacked, crates filled with rifle rounds, mortar shells, grenades, and anti-tank missiles. Supplies for survival were loaded as well. Boxes of food rations, massive containers of drinking water, medical kits, spare equipment parts, fuel storage bladders, portable generators, and field repair tools were all packed into the aircraft. The loading process happened with incredible speed and precision. As soon as one aircraft reached maximum capacity, it taxied toward the runway and took off for the Middle East. Another aircraft immediately rolled forward to begin loading. The supply pipeline had been opened, and it would operate 24 hours a day without stopping. By the time the first combat units reached the desert staging base, additional waves of troops, vehicles, and supplies would already be on the way behind them. The entire military machine was now in motion, building momentum with every passing hour. And while the world watched the growing tension in the region, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. A massive military buildup was underway, one that could change the balance of power in the Middle East at any moment. The question everyone was now asking was simple but terrifying. What would happen next? Because once forces of this scale begin moving into position, history often follows soon after.